la la, played upon a Spanish guitar. May sound silly as can be, but it all depends on where you are. One night in the plaza, the national jazzer performed at command of the king. And I've got to hand it to that Spanish bandit. He certainly knows a good thing. La Carmencita, the sweet senorita, that wonderful kid from Madrid. She carried on so that poor old Alfonso had only one thought, keep his lid. She wriggled and jiggled and oh, how she wiggled, and that wasn't all that she did. For she had improvement on all other movements. That wonderful kid from Madrid, la la. Tra la 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 la. Gee, I'd like to be a Spanish king. First, I'd buy me a guitar. Then I'd learn to play upon the thing. I'd get Carmencita, la belle senorita, for what could be sweeter than that? I'd tickle fandangos while she jazzed those tangos and played every tune in some flat. La Carmencita, the sweet senorita, that wonderful kid from Madrid. She still done casco so full of Tabasco, he nearly went off of his lid. The king hollered daily for her ukulele. Did he like it? I'll say he did. For this Spaniola was some mean gondola, that wonderful kid from Madrid. Wula. He still done casco so full of Tabasco, he nearly went off of his lid. The king hollered daily for her ukulele. Did he like it? I'll say he did. That wonderful kid from Madrid, ooh-la.
Going down, 'twas on a night like this. I whispered, be true to me, and she sighed, many skies have turned to gray because we're far apart. Many moons have passed away and still she's in my heart. We made a promise and sealed it with a kiss in a little Spanish town. 'Twas on a night like
his guitar. And every night, while the moon's shining bright, he would strum her a sweet little diddly-um-de-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-de-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-de-dum, dum-dum-dum. But she loved a handsome bullfighter. He caught them shooting one night. He ran his spear through this gay cavalry, and that was the end of his diddly-um-de-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-de-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-de-dum, dum-dum-dum. Sweet was the Floreador, cruel was the Toreador. With his diddly-um-de-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-de-dum, with the springtime came the ring time. So they were married one day, lived happy after they came. With his diddly-um-de-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-de-dum, way down Proctor, flown away. You heard about old Abdel Hamid. The women put him on the bun. One night he dropped dead. When they opened his head, they found millions and one little diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, dum-dum-dum. I saw a sweet girl at the Folly. How she made the audience come. She wasn't an actor, but a heaven's protector when she started singing and diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, dum-dum-dum. Sweet was the Floreador, cruel was the Toreador. With this diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, with the springtime came the ring time. So they were married one day, lived happy after they say. With his diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, way down Proctor, blown away. You heard about Jimmy Felitis, sent for the doctors to come. The doctor said, Felitis, you've got appendicitis, so I'll have to cut out your diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, dum-dum-dum. You heard about Billy O'Brien, who made us cut whiskey and run. That foxy old fellow, he stocked up his cellar. At night he goes there for his diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, dum-dum, diddly-um-dum, dum-dum-dum.
Well, amigas y amigos, dear friends, it happens only seldom that we welcome such a distinguished personality like we're doing today. And I am, in fact, not only very glad, but also very honored to introduce Professor Richard Kagan. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us today. And I can only say I will keep my words extremely short because we're all looking forward to listen to your talk very soon. Professor Kagan has recently published The Spanish Craze, America's Fascination with the Hispanic World, 1779-1939, which will very soon be made available in Spanish as well under the title El Embrujo de España, and indeed with a very renowned publishing company, Marcial Pons. The Spanish Craze is an ambitious book, not only telling the compelling story of the centuries-long US fascination with the history, literature, art, culture, and architecture of Spain, but also offering a new understanding of the origins of Hispanidad in America. We have mentioned the word fascination, but truth to be told, as Spanish power weakened, her image suffered an important reputational damage, and the so-called Black Legend, by which Spain was a country of innate cruelty and bigotry, influenced Americans, as seen in the US propaganda during the Spanish-American War of 1898. However, the Black Legend partially retreated soon thereafter, and Spanish culture and heritage became increasingly attractive to the American public for its perceived authenticity. Although these Spanish Craze infected regions where the Spanish New World presence was most felt, like California, the American Southwest, Texas, and of course Florida, there were also early, quite serious flare-ups of this craze in Chicago, New York, and New England, as Professor Kagan shows in his book. Revisiting early interest in Hispanism among American elites, and delving deeply into Hispanophiles such as Washington Irving or Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. At the same time, his research also shows how Spain's own elites tried to share with the English-speaking world the image of a Hispanic identity that went well beyond country borders. I have said that The Spanish Craze is a very ambitious book, but that doesn't do it any justice. It is something rarely seen, a very important book, not only by the extraordinary quality of the writing and research, which I have to say we take for granted coming from Professor Kagan, but also because of its scope and the way it alters the way we see the relations between the American world and the Hispanic sphere. And for this, I can only say congratulations, Professor Kagan, and thank you. Even though most of you will be familiar with his work, I think it is worth mentioning some highlights of our guest's CV. Richard Loring Kagan has been a professor at Johns Hopkins University for almost 50 years now, specializing in the history of imperial Spain, but not limited to it, since he has long-standing interests in other fields, as his new book showcases, like art history, cultural history, history of cartography, urban history, etc. I also believe that he has a very strong interest in integrating literature into the study of history, as shows also in his joint appointment as professor in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at Johns Hopkins. Also, it is worth noting that Professor Kagan is a disciple and friend of the much revered Sir John Eliot, one of the greatest historians of the Atlantic empires. Professor Kagan is a corresponding member of Spain's Royal Academy of History, and among his many books, one could mention, among others, Students and Society in Early Modern Spain, Lawsuits and Litigants in Castile, between the 16th and the 18th century, Lucretia's Dreams, Politics and Prophecy in 16th century Spain, and Urban Images of the Hispanic World between 1493 and 1793. He has also edited and contributed to several volumes, including Spanish Cities of the Golden Age, Spain, Europe, and the Atlantic World, Spain in America, The Origins of Hispanism in the United States, among others, as I said. In recent times, he has also researched the world of Jews, conversos, and crypto-Jews, as well as the politics of history in medieval and early modern Spain. As I said at the beginning, it is only very seldom that we welcome an intellectual figure of such a high standing. So thank you, Professor Kagan, and thank you to our audience today. Just a quick reminder that if anyone wants to ask a question, please feel free to do so and write it down in the chat, and I will pick them up for a brief Q&A at the end of the talk. And now, querido profesor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Director Pero. I much appreciate that very kind introduction, and good evening to you all. I assume it's good evening. It's good afternoon. I'm speaking to you all from Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, and I'm going to see if this my PowerPoint now works, and I'm going to start the let's start the this is the hard part. Why isn't it coming up in that top of the, how do I get these from the beginning? Why am I not getting these, the screen thing? There's something in the top, okay. All right, there we go. All right, well, shortly after I began work and received the invitation from the Instituto to talk about my recent book, I discovered Kirsty Hooper's new book, The Edwardians and the Making of a Modern Spanish Obsession, which was published just the end of last year, and which examined a more or less contemporaneous mini Spanish craze in the UK. It was a kind of a cultural phenomenon I just didn't know anything about before Hooper's book. And as in the US, the UK at the start of the 20th century experienced a craving for Spanish music, for flamenco dancers, They were all the rage, and the elegant London women, like those in New York, wore the mantillas de Manila, or the so-called Spanish shawl. There are also Spanish-themed exhibitions at Earl's Court and other London venues. But there was one marked difference between the Edwardian obsession and America's Spanish craze. So the expositions in London proved a relative bust, and Britain's Spanish craze, in comparison with that of the US, was a rather evanescent phenomenon. Like many fads, it was over almost as soon as it began. So I said to myself, why this difference? What happened? And in my talk today, I hope an answer to that question will emerge. Now, I'd like to begin this speech or talk with a speech delivered in Washington, D.C. on the 8th of June, 1912. The occasion was the inauguration of the new Christopher Columbus fountain that was adjacent to that city's main train station. The speaker, here you see him, Joseph Scott, was the director of Los Angeles's Chamber of Commerce. And Scott, surprised, and he may have even startled the assembled crowd when he remarked that, and I quote, "Long before the so-called Anglo-Saxon had set foot as a colonist upon the American soil, the Spanish race, with its indomitable faith, pursued almost alone its mission of civilization and evangelization of the Aborigines of America." End of quote. Now, that kind of language is a little bit out of touch with today's language, but his ringing endorsement of Spain, its people, and its culture epitomized what I like to call the Spanish craze in the United States. That is a moment in the nation's history when all things Spanish, art, music, food, language, literature, architecture, and more were in vogue. And this craze, I should add, was not America's only craze. There was a Japan craze, a Dutch craze, and an Indian craze centered on the handicrafts of North America's native peoples. That began in the 1890s. There was also a Mexican craze that began in the 1930s. And together these crazes were all offshoots of the growing cosmopolitanism that first swept this country towards the close of the 19th century, and which occasioned new interest in foreign cultures, the acquisition of artifacts illustrative of these cultures, together with increased travel abroad. And the broader phenomenon, let's call it, or we can call it the appropriation of the other, also accounts for the Spanish craze. But this craze, compared with the others I've just mentioned, proved exceptionally durable. And it began in the 1890s and lasted until the 1930s, when it finally ran its course. In other words, it went on far longer. It was much more deeply ingrained and entrenched in American cultures than the Edwardian obsession with Spain. I want to also emphasize that the Spanish craze in the US, as opposed to Britain, was not exclusively Spanish in the peninsular sense of the term. Rather, it intermingled with various elements of Mexican culture, and I can just use one famous example. You all know about this guy, Zorro, who, though born in Mexico, was generally referred to as Spanish in several Hollywood films of the early 1920s. And what is also known as, it also harbored an important neo-Moorish or Mudéjar tone, as well demonstrated in various cinema palaces and other places of entertainment across the country. And though what is generally known as Spanish revival architecture, as you see here illustrated in Balboa Park in San Diego, constructed in 1915, was actually a blend of Spanish design elements with others more properly defined as Spanish colonial or really Mexican. One other caveat I should mention: there was not just one Spanish craze in the United States, but many, as different parts of the country embraced what was understood as Spanish culture for different reasons and then in differing ways. California, for example, connected it with Mexico, as you see here, whereas in Florida, the linkage was primarily to southern Spain, especially Andalusia, and that region's Muslim, and you can read Oriental past. And all this sounds a bit contradictory, and it was, mainly because Americans at the end of the 19th century looked upon both Spain and its culture in different, often conflicting ways. Now, these contradictions were readily apparent during the 1890s, an era marked by the country's discovery of Spanish and Spanish colonial art and culture, but also marked by growing political tensions between Spain and the United States that erupted in the short but decisive Spanish-American War of 1898. And this is an example of the kind of propaganda that was being diffused around the country at that particular time. Now, in the run-up to this conflict, anti-Spanish rhetoric, drawing upon the wellspring of anti-Spanish sentiment known as the Black Legend, reached a fever pitch as jingoist newspapers, particularly those controlled by the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, headlined the inhumanity, the cruelty, the backwardness, and other failings of the Spanish regime in Cuba, along with those of the Spanish nation as a whole. On the other hand, as soon as the war ended, and as this cartoon illustrates, attitudes towards Spain turned decidedly favorable, and for reasons that I hope my presentation this evening will explain. And I've included in some of these slides some little quips so that help you read what I'm trying to say about these images to make them a bit more clear. Now first, let's talk about the Spanish craze itself. What were its dimensions and what forms did it take? And I'd like to begin with architecture, Spanish-themed architecture. And the opening in St. Augustine, Florida, that's on the northeast coast of Florida in 1887, with the Grand Resort Hotel of Ponce de Leon, which with its blend of Spanish and Moorish style that was meant to evoke notions of Mediterranean come Oriental luxury and delight, a kind of pleasure palace in the South. And 2 years later, that same Mediterranean come Oriental style appeared again in the 300-foot tower modeled after the Giralda in Seville and attached to Manhattan's new Madison Square Garden. Now, in the 16th century, as you know, the Giralda in Seville acquired a new spire topped by an angel known as the Giraldillo, symbolically intended to demonstrate the triumph of Christianity over Islam. However, in this Giralda in New York, the architect Stanford White, who was a notorious womanizer, replaced the angel with a gilded statue of the naked Diana, the Roman goddess of the hunt, as you see here. Now, Diana's nakedness in Victorian New York was a source of controversy, but otherwise White's Giralda elicited nothing but praise, but not as a Moorish tower, as it ought to have been said, but rather as a tower of Spanish Renaissance, and some called it Spanish Baroque design. Now, this Spanish Giralda in New York soon found many imitators across the United States. 18 in all were constructed in the course of several decades. Among them, one in San Francisco, built in 1898, and it survived the famous earthquake 10 years later that devastated much of that city. There were others in Coney Island, New York, but the one in Coney Island, New York was constructed in white and covered with red hearts. I'm sorry, I don't have a color photograph. There's another one, Coral Gables, in Kansas City, and later ones in Cleveland and elsewhere. And nor did this America's fascination with Spanish-themed buildings end with Giralda. In Southern California, for example, growing interest in the region's Hispanic or Mexican heritage led initially to a style of mission-style buildings of the kind you see here, the first of which dated from the 1890s. But this simple mission style, as was known, soon metamorphosed into something more elaborate, a more elaborate mixture of Spanish colonial, or we could call it Churrigueresque architecture. They call it Spanish Revival in the US, as you see here in the building that Grosvenor Goodhue erected in San Diego's Balboa Park in conjunction with the California exposition that was held there in the year 1915. Now, arguably, the design of these buildings was more Mexican than Spanish. But in keeping with the cultural allegiance I mentioned earlier, local reporters praised the architect for having created with this kind of architecture, the quote, the atmosphere of a Spanish city, okay, and succeeding in evoking the spirit of what they called Old Spain. In other words, it was not Mexico they were looking at; they were looking at Spain. And shortly thereafter, William Randolph Hearst, notwithstanding his earlier political campaign against Spain, ordered his architect, Julia Morgan, to design his main house on the Enchanted Hill in San Simeon in Southern California, in what Hearst defined as the Baroque style of Southern Spain, a region he had visited some years before. Meanwhile, the so-called Andalusian farmhouse style figured prominently in a raft of Spanish revival houses in Santa Barbara and other parts of California, each sharing certain common design elements: unadorned, stuccoed, whitewashed walls, plateresque door and window surrounds, red tile roofs, interior patios, and the like, as you see here in the Casa de Herrero, built in Montecito, California in 1925. But California was not alone in its efforts to use architecture to evoke that region's Spanish past. The search for such roots was especially pronounced in those parts of the country that could legitimately claim or at least invent Spanish roots. And here, an example from New Mexico, where they built this interesting looking shrine temple. You can still see it today. And in 1914, that was designed to evoke Granada and Santa Fe of Granada, the encampment that Ferdinand and Isabel built out that city just before its conquest before its conquest in 1492. You see a similar search for a Spanish past in Lubbock, Texas, where the administration building of Texas Tech University was modeled upon the facade of the Colegio de Mayor of San Ildefonso at the University of Alcalá de Henares, a 16th century construction. And you find the same in Florida, where Addison Misner, starting in 1918, 1919, built a whole number of Spanish mansions in the Spanish style, as you can see in this building, Mirasol. You find the same in Coral Gables, just just outside of Miami, which was a planned Spanish city built with Spanish-style homes. You find more of the same in St. Petersburg, and there's this interesting hotel whose tower was modeled after the Torre de Oro in Seville, and I could go on with more examples. Now, it's tempting, it's very tempting to conceive of this style, this kind of Spanish style in regional terms, and link solely to those portions of the US that could legitimately claim a Spanish or a Mexican past. But this hardly begins to explain its popularity in parts of those countries that lack Spanish roots. Arkansas, for example, where you see this wonderful Spanish house dating from 1927. Or here's three examples: a shopping center in Wilmette, Illinois, just outside Chicago; William Vanderbilt II Spanish cottage in Long Island, just east of New York City; or this Spanish revival house in Baltimore, not far from where I used to live, that was constructed there in 1925. And even in staid New England, which really adhered to English style architectures, or Queen Anne style architectures, or Victorian style architecture, you have Leicester Scheid, a Spanish house, which was constructed in West Hartford, Connecticut, in the sense that you find it all over the country. And unless you think it was just mansions and upmarket houses or upscale patrons that were who patronized this particular style, there was a mass marketing phenomenon as well, with Sears Roebuck and Company and other national chains beginning to market Spanish houses to the American, the middle class. Spain, in short, or Spanish revival architecture, it was in. You had to have one if you were anybody. But architecture alone was not enough to quench America's growing thirst for Spain. Of key importance was language. The decades immediately following the country's victory over Spain in 1898 brought with it an unprecedented bottoms-up demand for the study of Spanish that was so widespread that it prompted complaints on the parts of teachers of other foreign languages, particularly French and Italian. They complained about it. They said the study of that language, Spanish language, should deliberately be checked on the grounds that Spain had no literature or culture worth studying. Now, much of this demand for Spanish language instruction was propelled by the rise of commercial opportunities, both in the Caribbean and Latin America, that was occasioned by America's victory in the War of 1898, along with the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914. But it also coincided with a newfound interest in the culture of that country's recently vanquished foe. So it was around 1917, one Spanish newspaper proudly reported that New Yorkers were dressing like Spaniards, that they were eating cocidos and paellas and drinking vino de Jerez. Fashion came next, particularly women's fashion. And as in England, the mantilla de Manila was all the rage, as you can see in these images, or in these two portraits of two society women by Zuloaga, Mrs. Randolph Hearst, that was painted in Paris, actually, and Alice Garrett, who was a socialite in Baltimore. And in addition to wearing these mantillas and Spanish headdresses, you had to have other Spanish accessories as well, such as these Carmen cigarettes. And I could go on and on with more of these powders and the like that we would wear in Spanish bath fittings and the like. At the same time, Spanish music, one critic called it the blaze, was also in fashion, flamenco in particular. And I think just before my talk began, you heard snippets of songs by Spanish popular music that was in vogue during the 1920s in New York and elsewhere. And it was also a new vogue for Spanish literature, particularly the novels of the famed Spanish author Vicente Blasco Ibáñez, whose novels not only became bestsellers, but were quickly transformed into motion pictures. As you see here, featuring such stars as Rudolph Valentino. And then there were a whole raft of other Spanish pictures featuring some of the hot stars of the moment, among them Mary Pickford and Dolores del Rio. And further testimony underscoring the strength and the momentum of the Spanish craze came in 1923, when a movie producer by the name of Lee de Forest, the director of the first talking picture ever made, featured the voice of the Spanish flamenco singer Concha Piquer, who was already a star in New York. And if we had more time, I could show a short clip of Piquer singing and dancing. Piquer, however, was by no means the first Spanish dancer to achieve notoriety in the US. That distinction belongs to the dancer known as La Carmencita, who starting in 1890, the same year in which Manhattan inaugurated its version of Seville's Heralda, La Carmencita achieved stardom following her performance at a private party in the studio of the artist William Merritt Chase. And she was the toast of the town, so much so that Thomas Edison, the famous inventor, he had something called the Vitascope, and he made what we think is the first short motion picture ever made, starring Carmencita. Carmencita features as the Pearl of Seville. It only lasted for about 45 seconds, but you could see her dancing as well, where you see shot as stills from that little film here in this little clip. Now, I mentioned William Merritt Chase, and that Chase had served as Carmencita's New York sponsor was no accident. He belonged to a generation of American artists who journeyed to Spain in search of themes defined as picturesque. That is to say, crumbling ruins and peasants garbed in traditional dress, gypsies, bullfighters, together with anything, ruins in particular, anything that was connected with Muslim Spain. Now, the roots of this artistic craze can be traced to to Britain and to the work of such artists as David Roberts and John Frederick Lewis, as you see here, who visited Spain during the 1820s and 1830s. And it also appeared later in the work of Lord Frederick Leighton. But in the US, much more so than Britain, Spanish-themed paintings were truly in vogue. And I'll just show you a few. Samuel Coleman's Views of the Alhambra in Seville, painted during the 1860s. Paintings by Thomas Eakins and Mary Cassatt, dating from the late 60s and the early 70s. And perhaps most famously, John Singer Sargent's El Jaleo, or Ruckus, all different takes, all different interpretations of the Spanish picturesque. As for William Merritt Chase, his first trip to Spain led to this picture, aptly entitled Sunny Spain. And in later ones, Chase encountered trips, Chase encountered the work of Velázquez, an artist whose naturalistic style had already been discovered by Manet, and one that Chase, especially in his portraits, had endeavored to emulate. And so taken, in fact, was Chase with Velázquez, that he went so far as to dress up his daughter in dresses modeled after those depicted in Velázquez's Las Meninas. He painted her in that garb as well. And he also staged a series of tableaux vivants in his house in Long Island, his summer house in Long Island, in which he tried to reenact the scene from what is depicted by Velázquez and Las Meninas. And starting in the 1890s, moreover, Chase led groups of art students to the Prado so that they too could have the opportunity. And here I quote him directly, to revel in Velázquez, not forgetting Greco, Goya, and a few more Spanish artists. And a list that included Joaquin Sorolla and Ignacio Zuloaga, two artists whose work, starting with the runaway success of the Sorolla exhibition in New York's newly opened showcase of Spanish art, the Hispanic Society of America in 1909, would soon take the country by storm. But now, artistic interest in Spanish subjects also helped to awaken new interest in Spanish art, a school of painting that American critics had previously dismissed as something devoid of the poetical, devoid of the imaginative, devoid of refined treatment and intellectual elevation. In fact, totally lacking in popular value or interest. But such opinions, interestingly, began to change in the 1890s, which is a moment when a whole new generation of art critics detected a similarity between the freedom of expression and naturalistic style of Velázquez and El Greco, and that of the French Impressionists. That is, artists whose work they celebrated, and also ones that the country's avant-garde collectors were eager to acquire. And the rapid diffusion of these ideas about the supposed modernity of old master Spanish art unleashed the artistic equivalent of the Alaska gold rush of 1897, with wealthy collectors across the country competing with one another in a no holds barred competition to scoop up choice examples of works attributed often erroneously at the time to El Greco, Goya, and Velázquez. Key players in this little game included Isabella Stewart Gardner in Boston. She acquired her first Spanish picture, Zuberan, on a trip to Spain in 1891, and later placed it on display together with other Spanish objects in the so-called Spanish chapel that she incorporated into her otherwise Italianate house museum in Boston, known as Fenway Court. Other purchasers, or big purchasers of Spanish art, included New York's Henry and Louisine Havemeyer. They were particularly interested in work by El Greco, or the multi-mega millionaire, the steel magnate Henry C. Frick, who liked Velázquez and El Greco so much that the first portrait we have of him depicts the collector with, as you can see, with his Velázquez's Philip IV over his right shoulder, and his portrait of Vicencio Atanagi by El Greco over his left shoulder. And they still can both be seen in the Frick Museum in New York, currently in the so-called Frick Madison, its temporary quarters on Madison Avenue in New York City. But they're not the only ones. And I should also say that the motivations of these collectors competing for works by prominent Spanish artists were not always exactly the same. Archer Milton Huntington, for example, founder of the Hispanic Society, he was a true Hispanophile, and he purchased Spanish books and art objects for the purpose of showcasing the country's rich cultural heritage. In contrast, William Randolph Hearst, his penchant for Spanish art related in part to his interest in Spanish architecture, but it is also tied to his ideas about America's cultural entitlement, particularly his notion that the treasures of Europe's old tired monarchies would be cared for far better under his tutelage than in Europe itself. And unfortunately for Spain, its defeat in the War of 1898 rendered it particularly susceptible to what has been mischievously described as Hearst's incontinent collectionism, a wonderful phrase. And in other words, to the victors belong the spoils. And that helps to explain the language Hearst employed in 1905, when, on the verge of his first visit to Spain, he informed his mother that, and he wrote, "We will burst through the Pyrenees into Spain and ravage the country." How does that strike you, Mom? And ravage Hearst did, acquiring sculptures galore, Mudéjar ceilings, the famed choir screen now on display in New York's Metropolitan Museum, or two reconstructed monasteries that he had deconstructed and then reconstructed. One of them you can visit in North Miami, Florida today, and it's a favorite wedding venue for many couples who live in that city. Now, Hearst's particular interest in, quote, ravaging separated him from most other US collectors who focused on Spanish art. But all of this begs the question, why Spain? Why Spanish art, especially when it was deprecated just a few decades before? Now, of crucial importance here was a profound change in the way the country, that is America, perceived both Spain and its culture. The change in question, I believe, can be traced back to the 1820s and 30s and the appearance of, and particularly the appearance of Washington Irving's best-selling Tales of the Alhambra in 1831. Prior to Irving, Spain's image in the US, as in the UK, was steeped in the Black legend. It was a dark, forbidding, somber nation, weakened by ignorant priests, malevolent inquisitors, and tyrannical kings. In contrast, Irving's Spain was sunny Spain, brimming with adventure, tinged with a hint of Orientalism, and more importantly, it was relentlessly picturesque. Now, Irving was by no means the only writer to conjure up this romantic image of Spain, but his picture of a quasi-exotic country, a kind of accessible Orient, proved irresistible. And during that era, the mid-19th century, images of this Spain, with all of its attractions, featured prominently in the lectures of the famed travel writer and lecturer John Stoddard. It also appeared in dozens of travel accounts bearing romanticized titles such as Spain, Last of the Land of the Castanets. And it was also featured in magazines whose publishers seemingly never tired of presenting Spain as if picturesque scenes straight out of the Middle Ages could be readily encountered in every garden and in every street and on every street corner. Now, this image of Spain, of this romantic Spain, was of course a stereotype. But it was precisely that stereotype, with its gypsy dancers, its dashing matadors, and peasants stretched out for a siesta in the afternoon sun, that not only generated new interest in Spain, but also represented that's the Spain that Americans with the means to travel sought to include on their itineraries abroad. That old Spain, pre-industrial Spain, unmaterialistic Spain, authentic Spain, these were the same qualities that attracted Martin Milton Huntington to Spain, along with such writers as Gertrude Stein, who first arrived there in 1889, and here she is in her Parisian apartment with a portrait of her by Picasso on the wall. And it was that same old Spain, pre-industrial, authentic Spain, that attracted the like of writers such as Ernest Hemingway to Spain, although he was also attracted by its trout fishing, its bullfights, and cheap brandy in his case also helped. Now, equally important, and there's another side to this. So it's not just sunny Spain. There's another Spain that emerges quite uniquely in the United States as opposed to Britain in the course of the 19th century. And that is the idea of Spain as a country, as James Scott, that is the person the speaker I alluded to at the outset of this talk, had contributed enormously to the march of civilization in the Americas. Now, the seeds of this particular idea can be found in the work of the famed historian, Boston historian, William Pickling Prescott, whose history of the conquest of Mexico credited Spain with the overthrow of the semi-civilized Aztecs, together with the advance of progress and religion in the New World. And he was almost instrumental in developing that idea. He had many followers, however. But that idea, the idea of Spain with a mission civilisatrice, that idea proved infectious and helps to explain why the United States Congress in the 1840s added a painting featuring Hernando de Soto's discovery of the Mississippi River to a series of pictures celebrating the history of the United States that was hung in the rotunda of the new Capitol being constructed in Washington, D.C., effectively adding that conquistador to the country's roster of founding fathers and grafting that chapter of Spain's history onto the history of the United States. There's no real precedent for such an action. And you can say that same grafting, that same linkage can be found in the bas-relief frieze that was added to the rotunda during the 1870s. It offered more of the same, strengthening a particular bond between Spain and the United States just at a moment when such popular writers as Charles Loomis were applauding the humane and progressive spirit of Spanish pioneering in the America's Southwest, and Helen Hunt Jackson's best-selling novel, Ramona, first published in 1884, represented the Spanish missions in California as utopian spaces where kindly friars taught natives the benefits of work, religion, civilization, and the arts. Ramona's popularity not only burnished the image of Spain in the US, but also lent momentum to California's budding tourist industry, helping to spark efforts to refurbish the region's crumbling missions and together with the campaign to restore the famed Camino Real linking Mexico to San Francisco. Now, Ramona, Jackson's book, together with Loomis's pioneers, helped trigger in California, at least, the cult surrounding the figure of Junipero Serra, and also spawned a whole series of Spanish history, fake kind of history festivals, such as the Cabrillo Festival that was held in San Diego beginning in 1892. And there were many more such heritage festivals staged or organized in California, the Southwest, Texas, as well as in California, helping these regions to forge, or at least in some cases even invent a historical heritage comparable to those of the states of New England. In other words, these states wanted founding fathers. They wanted, they didn't have their English forebears. They looked to Spain instead for their historical roots, not to England. And that same linkage between Spain and the United States helps to explain the prominent place accorded to Spain in Chicago's World Columbian Exposition of 1893, and linking the America's cultural heritage to that of the famous mariner, as well as his Spanish patron, Queen Isabella. Now, to be sure, and as I said earlier, not everything in the 1890s went in Spain's favor. Isabella's image and that of Spain in general suffered from the tsunami of anti-Spanish propaganda that inundated the country prior to the War of 1898. Yet, as far as I've been able to determine, that wave dissipated as soon as the war ended, as that cartoon I showed you earlier, evoking the theme of forgive and forget, readily attests. And an additional momentum came from the reassessment of Spain's contribution to the history of North America that followed in the wake of Spain's defeat of the Spanish-American War of 1898, the final conflict in an imperial rivalry that had begun over a century before. Much as many Americans had displayed a tendency to romanticize the continent's so-called vanishing Indian in the 19th century, their early 20th century counterparts did the same with respect to Spain, when that country, in the wake of defeat, no longer posed a threat to American interests in the Caribbean. The idea forgive and forget, and this is just what America did. Notably, at the Pan American Exposition opened in Buffalo in 1901, an exposition whose principal theme was hemispheric unity, but all under the watchful eye of Uncle Sam. And it's interesting that that exposition centerpiece was yet another Geralda replica, outfitted with thousands of electric lights, whereas other buildings were built in the Spanish style in the belief that it best embodied the idea of America, both North and South. And it's kind of a linkage that we rarely find today. And perhaps one other demonstration of this kind of linkage of the two heritages dates from a slightly earlier moment in the history of the country, from an exhibition this exposition held in Santa Fe in New Mexico in 1883. And the organizer of the event invited one of the country's most famous poets, Walt Whitman, to write a poem to be read at the festival on the festival's opening day. And that invitation arrived too late for Whitman, who was then aged almost 90, to compose such a poem. But he forwarded a letter emphasizing the important role that the Spanish character had forged or formed in creating what he called our future national personality. Now, Whitman's language is flowery, as you can read here, but the message is crystal clear, taking direct aim at nativists who narrowly identified America as Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, white. Whitman's America was an ever-growing, ever-changing system of related parts, a country that needed to accommodate and incorporate Spain and its heritage into the national mystique. Now, others, such as James Scott, uttered similar sentiments, noting that Spain and America were essentially brethren in arms to the extent that the two countries shared a common historic mission, that of converting the hemisphere's indigenous population to Christianity, and thus furthering the cause of civilization itself. And as Scott saw it, Spain's brave soldiers and courageous missionaries initiated that campaign in the 16th century. The United States, what had become the new standard bearer of the Americas, now had that responsibility to see that same mission through to completion. And from that linkage emerged the idea that whatever their political differences between Spain and the United States, these were but superficial and temporary, inasmuch as the culture, language, indeed the history of the two countries were deeply and profoundly intertwined. Now, much of that was pure invention, but it allowed Spanish-style houses, and here I should add Spanish tiles, furniture, music, art, and dance, to be understood in terms of dignity, honesty, simplicity, sincerity. In other words, words that map that precisely onto the words of Alexis Tocqueville, Mark Twain, and other observers had previously used to describe the American character in the 19th century. In this sense, things Spanish were homegrown, autochthonous, organic, and historical. And from this perspective, the Spanish craze was not so much America's discovery of Spain, but America's discovery of itself. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm finished.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kagan. This was utterly fascinating. I wanted to ask whether...
How do I end share screen? Can I have to do that?
I don't know, maybe Joaquin can help you with that.
Okay, you did, thank you.
So if anyone has a question, please write it down. I myself have one or two. I wanted to ask you, Professor Kagan, whether is there a certain so are the Americans aware of this Hispanic and in a way, Hispanic heritage, mainly when it is concerned with architecture? Are there any efforts in conservation of this heritage? Are they so is there an awareness? I mean, foundations maybe devoted to that you're aware of, or is it well looked after, or is it somehow threatened?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I don't know of any foundations that are specifically organized to protect the Spanish heritage. And I'm sorry to say, many of those Spanish homes dating from the teens and the 20s are now long gone. And in my book, I give several examples of those that were demolished in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and as people sought other styles. But Spanish revival architecture still can be found throughout the South and the Southwest and California, and it's still in vogue in many respects at various income levels. You can buy mansions in Hollywood or cheap bungalows in other parts of Los Angeles as well. The interesting thing about that heritage is, though, it's currently, as you probably know, under attack and being disputed. It started last year with the attack on various statues of Columbus or De Soto or Juan de Oñate in New Mexico, and even for that statue of Juan de Junipero Serra that I showed you was unfortunately decapitated sometime last summer and covered with red paint to symbolize the indigenous blood that the Spaniards had spilled in their efforts to, quote, civilize the natives. And in a sense, that heritage is now being seen as a colonialist or an imperialist heritage, rather than something that, as Prescott saw it, or my guys in the late 19th century saw it, as a step forward in the march of civilization. For me, those attacks on the statues is less an attack on Spain and Spanish culture than attack on colonialism in general, and the whole idea of imperialism. And it may be even seen as an attack on whiteness in the sense of that these European cultures came to North America and destroyed the pre-existing indigenous cultures. And I've said this in print in several publications in Spain. I think in an article I published in ABC last summer. So that heritage, on the one hand, the people appreciate it. On the other hand, there's other groups in the United States who see it as it's somewhat suspicious. But those two, I think, can exist side by side, and we'll see what happens.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Now, Kath A asks whether would it be accurate to say that the U.S. view of Spain was an idealized picture of Andalusia rather than encompassing any other regions of Spain?
Well, that's good. I mean, Andalusia, as I said, loomed very large, particularly in Florida and in that so-called Andalusian farmhouse style. But we do have manifestations of other aspects, at least in architecture, as I showed you that in Texas, where Lubbock, if you go to Lubbock, Texas, not many people go to Lubbock, Texas, in the Texas Panhandle, where Alcalá de Henares figures prominently. There's also replicas of several buildings from Salamanca as well, the Palacio de Monterrey. So it's not just Andalusia. It's a bit more than that. And Andalusia does not begin to explain the interest in Spanish art and Spanish music. It's more than that. But I grant you that Andalusia figured prominently in the American imagination. And interestingly, it figured prominently in the architecture of Seville in the 19-teens and 1920s, when whose name I'm going to forget his name, the Marquez. Why can't I forget my own book? He's a function of, or the Marquez of Vagan-Inclán went to California in 1913, fell in love with the Spanish bungalows and whitewashed houses he saw there. And he came back, started buying up streets in the barrio, and old houses in the barrio Santa Cruz in Seville, and started refurbishing these buildings a la Californiano in the 1920s. And it was called by an architect in the 1920s, El Estilo de Ida y Vuelta, the style that went from Spain to America, and then was brought back to Spain, and then refashioned into what we said the image of Spain, the image of Spain that American tourists, above all, wanted to see. They wanted to see that romantic Spain, the sunny Spain, described to them initially by Washington Irving and others, and which they saw depicted in paintings by Colvin and the like. So Andalusia is important, yes. Good for Andalusia.
Well, I think that's all for now. So, well, thank you very much again, Professor Kagan. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today, and I vividly recommend your book to anyone interested. But just a second, Paz Balibrea, who's also a very well-known researcher here in London, asks, how would you say that the Spanish Civil War connects with continuous rising conflict with the interest in things Spanish in the US?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons, and the Spanish craze dies out in the 1930s for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is the onset of the Francoist regime. And since if Spain was in during the 1920s, it's out by the end of the 1930s and remained on the out until the start of Spanish democracy and at the death of Franco and the renewal of the Spanish democracy in the late 1970s and in 1980s. And in my epilogue in the concluding chapters of the book, I talk about the renewed interest in Spain that took place in the United States at that particular moment. So there was a kind of a morbid fascination with the Spanish Civil War, as you can see in the work of Hemingway, in such works as the For Whom the Bell Tolls, which was published in 1939. But when the bell that it was tolling in that novel was, it was tolling the death of the Spanish craze and kind of a political distancing and cultural distancing between Spain and America. In a sense, much of the old black legend was renewed and given renewed force during the 1940s and 50s. And it took a long time until the 1970s and 80s for that to begin to dissipate. And so it's a chapter which would be marked by the kind of the disappearance of the craze, at the end of the craze that started up again in a very different manner at the end of the 20th century.
Well, excellent, Professor. Thank you very much again. And
my pleasure.
Just a quick reminder that the book, The Spanish Craze, will be translated into Spanish during the autumn under the title El Embrujo de España in Marcial Pons. Thank you very much, Professor, and everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias.